For more on the crisis in Venezuela, I spoke earlier to Jake Johnston from the Center for Economic and Policy Research, a think tank here in Washington. I asked him how dire the situation is there, and here's his response.
Yeah, well, it's an extremely dire situation. I mean, obviously the economic situation has been terrible for years and only getting worse. And obviously with the protests and the increasing polarization that we've seen and the violence, I think there is a real threat that only sort of continues. And I think there is a real threat of civil war even at this point and continued bloodshed.
It's interesting, Brookings came out with a piece in 2016. I was just looking at that before we sat down. It pointed to the victories of opposition parties or movements in the region, talked about how some were predicting the pink tide of leftist governments was receding. So how does that kind of play into all of this, the response of regional players in terms of how they interact with Venezuela at this stage?
Yeah, well, of course, we have seen a tremendous change in the hemisphere over the last couple of years. And whereas previously there were a majority of governments run by left political parties that were broadly allied with Venezuela, that situation has completely changed, right? And that has led to sort of an unprecedented level of criticism of the Venezuelan government within the region. Now, obviously, they deserve much of that criticism, but in terms of moving the situation forward and addressing it, this changing political dynamic has actually negatively impacted the ability to resolve the crisis in the first place.
Yeah, to that point, Peru's president says the unrest could lead to a bloodbath, a refugee crisis. Argentina's Mauricio Macri at the G20 attacked the Venezuelan government on human rights grounds. We're hearing a lot of that. So how does Venezuela respond to that? Do they become, I mean, obviously you would hope that the region itself could play a constructive role in trying to mediate this, but they can't really, can they, with that kind of rhetoric?
Yeah, well, what you saw years ago was the formation of these new regional organizations, UNASUR and CELAC, that both excluded the U.S. and Canada and was a more sort of sovereign Latin American-led organizations. Now, with the political changes, you've seen those sort of extremely weakened, and instead this focus on the Organization of American States. It was led by Secretary General Luis Almagro, who has been extremely undiplomatic and harsh, and really got into sort of a war of words with President Maduro. Has really discredited the institution as sort of an institution that could lead to a way out of this crisis. And so instead you see this sort of heated rhetoric from all sides here, and what it's done is really sort of only hardened both sides in Venezuela. So the opposition has seen regional support and become more emboldened, right? Why would they agree to stop protesting if region's governments are sort of seemingly picking sides in this power struggle in Venezuela? On the other side, you have Venezuela, who is sort of recognizing their isolation and hardening on their stance. And as they continue to repress protests, jail opposition leaders and the like, you're really only seeing this escalation of the conflict brought about by this regional dynamic.
Can you see a fair mediator kind of arriving on the scene? I mean, I've heard some people talk about the Vatican, the Pope perhaps playing a role, but I mean, is there anybody out there on the landscape that you think could step in and perhaps help with the mediation?
Yeah, well, I think that's a huge question at this point, right? We've seen some efforts from Spain and from some former leaders from Spain to try and play a role in the last couple of weeks. Obviously, that didn't lead to any serious breakthrough. But I think this is one of the big concerns now with the hemisphere, is that there's very few who seem either to have the credibility or even the willingness to try and provide a path forward, right? And I think at this point it is clear that dialogue and some sort of negotiated solution stemming from that dialogue and with elections is really the only way forward. And without that legitimate mediator stepping up from the region, it's hard to see that happening.
Jake Johnston, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.